Hello, everyone. Today is November 19th, 2018. This is the Cluster API vSphere provider meeting, public meeting. If everybody can, please go ahead and add your agenda and add your attendee information to the notes. Let me go ahead and copy a link to the chat here. Okay. Today, it may be a short meeting, I'm not sure. Mostly, it's going to be mostly about updates. And I'll be mostly taking notes. There will be a topic, a design topic I want to talk about at the end. Other than that, we have these agendas here. So why don't we go ahead and start off. KubeCon China update. I think we had two members of our team go to KubeCon Shanghai, and Hui and Fabio, perhaps you guys want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
With regard to Cluster API.
I can jump under my experience on the Cluster API in KubeCon Shanghai first, and Fabio can also share his experience.
Yeah, I mean, I can do that. Unfortunately, most of the talks were in Chinese, so I can understand most of them. But definitely, I can add some of my perspectives on that.
Sure, I'll do that. I'll do a short one regarding Cluster API. So I favorite 3 sessions regarding Cluster API because I'm working on that. So I'm able to attend it, I think, 2. And there, I think the general interest is very high from the number of people attended the session. And also the reason.
Do you know who the presenters were?
So one is Lucas. I think he's a Cluster API, Cluster Lifecycle. He did the Cluster Lifecycle introduction.
Okay.
Another is the Google engineer, Alex. I need to find the ID, but I know. Okay. And I want to share a little bit on this. The Google engineer, her topic is autoscaler and Cluster API, but she's kind of focused on the autoscaler point of view because that's her primary focus, and then saying to integrate with Cluster API to solve some of their problem because they have something called provider in the cluster autoscaler. And they have to work with different providers to implement. But with Cluster API, it's already there. Each provider is already taking care of how to create nodes.
You saying the GCP provider already integrates with the cluster with the autoscaler?
Yeah, she mentioned that, but it's basically a separate track. How different provider has a node group. Node group is kind of machines that we have, similar concept, and how to create the actual node.
Okay.
So they have maintained that, and they probably in the near future they still need to maintain that. But I think she clearly, at least from that working group point of view, they want to work with Cluster API to reuse Cluster API. Implementation.
Did they show a demo?
Show a demo?
Yeah. Did they show a demo?
Yes, she showed I think a simple demo. Yes.
Okay.
Actually, but the audience asked a question regarding Cluster API, how to do that. Does Cluster API handle different CNI? She cannot answer because she said she's not the Cluster API person. So I actually have to saying this is something be discussed in the cluster API meeting and on the roadmap. And so immediately after the session, there are several people come to ask me about cluster API question. So that's why I think there's a lot of interest from companies. One is actually he's saying they are doing some private cloud or private data center implementation. They want to implement a provider. He asking how to do that, where is the example to get started with, and that's one. Another is Alibaba. They are also asking how this can be used or can be leveraged.
Okay.
So from that, I think it's a lot of interest.
Okay. Anything else to add to this?
I'll let Fabio to share a bit more.
Fabio, do you have anything to talk about regarding to cluster API from KubeCon China?
No, not really. I had some side chats with some of the people there. Lux as one was there, and as we mentioned, he's I think one of the leaders in cluster lifecycle. So we had some side chat on the cluster API in general and on the direction of the project and so on. So not necessarily anything related to what we're doing here, but it was interesting. Unfortunately, as I said, there were a few sessions, and I think the one that who was mentioned was the one that I planned to attend, but I couldn't get. I tried to use the simultaneous translator, but it was not working for me. So I just gave up and I waited for Hui to provide an update on that. So yeah, nothing more to add.
Okay. How about in general? How did the what was the attendance like at the KubeCon China, and what was the interest level in Kubernetes from China?
Well, definitely high. I mean, people were very excited. I think it's there's a lot of there's a lot of players in the Kubernetes space that we don't necessarily know about. At least I didn't know about. So it's very active, and I think it's maturing very fast. And I've had some questions about our support for things like vSphere, and in general VMware platforms. And in general, seems to be a pretty popular platform to run also Kubernetes workloads.
Okay, so you actually met people who were using vSphere.
Yes, absolutely. It was I would say there was a lot of people going around the booth and asking questions to us even after the introduction we did for SIG VMware and the SIG deep dive we've done for SIG VMware. We had a lot of people asking questions about the various projects that we have, including other efforts like CSI and Cloud Provider and also Cluster API. So there's definitely a lot of movement around Kubernetes in China. Also movement around running Kubernetes workloads on-prem.
Okay, cool. That bodes well for the next topic, which is can you guys mute yourself? So KubeCon is in 3 weeks. We're currently, so we have one presentation. I think it was titled Using Cluster API Deploy Kubernetes Cluster On-Prem and in Public Cloud. I am doing that presentation with Chris Nova from Heptio, or I guess we can say now, well, Heptio for now. And today, she and I had our first meeting to talk about the outline of what we wanted to present, and the just general outline of. So the presentation is going to be less about how Cluster API works underneath. It's going to be more about this is what Cluster API is, and this is how you use it. We're going to talk a lot about the day 0 and day 2 operations that we intend for the Cluster API to have in the future. And the highlight of that presentation will be the demo. We're going to show the vSphere provider. We're going to show Fabio's awesome OVA in action, and we're also going to show the AWS provider. Now, the AWS, and this is going to be an interesting presentation because you know, the two providers are following two different patterns. What do I mean by that? So the cluster CTL and cluster API initially had this model, usage model that we've been terming self-service. So the self-service model is where you use cluster CTL. It creates a bootstrap cluster, it creates a target cluster, and then after that, it deletes the bootstrap cluster. There are some pros and cons of that approach. The approach that we're taking with the vSphere provider is that we're going to support the self-service model, but we're also going to support a more managed model. So you're gonna install the OVA, and then once you install the OVA, now you have the bootstrap cluster management cluster, and use cluster CTL against that cluster. And so there's pros and cons of that approach. The pros, obviously, is that if you create multiple target clusters with the cluster API using the self-service model, and you get the kube config back, and let's say that you lose the kube config, I'm not sure how you get back access to those clusters. I'm sure you can get the kube config if it's in the config map, but when you do the self-service model, there's no central source that actually tracks all the clusters that are being created, whereas the manager model, that central cluster will keep track of all the target clusters that are being created, so you can always recover.
So when you're saying self-service, means the bootstrap cluster be destroyed when deploy finished?
Yeah. There is an option in cluster CTL to not destroy the bootstrap cluster. The cluster CTL also has the option of using an existing cluster. I think that's the model that you're using for CI. And when you have an existing cluster, like the one that we're going to do with the OVA, it doesn't need to create a bootstrap cluster and doesn't need to clean up the management cluster at the end.
So I want to add one thing. I think it's sort of verifying our management cluster approach is more popular in the enterprise. eBay did a talk regarding how they manage their Kubernetes cluster internally. They don't use cluster API at all. I think they started a project 2 years ago, and they have a central, they call the kind of a seed cluster to manage all the other clusters. And they actually added a few CRDs on this seed cluster to help them manage all the other clusters. I think they actually don't know the cluster API, but I think the approach is very similar to cluster API.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of this concept it's not new and groundbreaking. It's just that this project is trying to create a unified universal APIs that every project can now utilize instead of creating their own. So so SAP has another system called Gartner that was started 6 months before Cluster API, and it looks very similar to Cluster API. They also call it a seed cluster also. I think the management cluster absolutely is the way to go for, I think, for the enterprise. And from the meetings in the working group, that appears to be the most popular among the different providers also. I think the AWS and the Google one is still very much focused on the self-service model. I could be wrong about GCP, but I thought that's what they were targeting. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about updates on CI. Hui, you want to give some updates on CI?
Sure. Can I share my screen?
Sure. I will stop sharing. Go ahead.
So first of all, the quick update is the 2PR log you have. Both the EDE CI test has been passed. And there's a minor issue when I update the CI to support both before CRD and after CRD changes. We have two versions of provided component spec, which corresponding to before CRD change and after CRD change. And that change had a little problem. I forgot to actually, we have two CI containers. I forgot to update the one CI containers. I made a change, but I didn't actually upload this container version. So after that, the CI, both CI pass, you can see this is the CRD change. This is not a big CRD change. This one is the big CRD change, the CI just passed. The other one is based on the CRD change, you have to remove the Terraform code, which should also pass this EDE test. So it means this, I think this CI should not block your progress for now. And you do need to address some other issue we can talk about offline. The other update I want to give is to integrate with the Pro. I draw a diagram here. I want to review a little bit with people here. You can see we have two diagrams. The reason is we actually have two CI containers. So the first one is we have a CI container that's running on a Pro cluster. The cluster is actually managed by basically by Google, or maybe not by Google in the future, but there's a central cluster that is called the Pro system. And we're going to have a container running there. And also we will give a secret file to Pro, and Pro going to mount these secrets to the container when the container runs. So with this container going to do is this container going to create a bootstrap cluster, and then going to launch a CI job at bootstrap cluster. So I think it's basically as simple as that. They monitor this job. This move, then this basically move to the next stage is now we have a bootstrap cluster. Then we run a CI job, which is the Kubernetes job, and run to finish. Then this end-to-end test.
Where is this bootstrap cluster running? Is it running on Google or is it running on VMC?
For now, this definitely running on VMC right now.
But when it goes to Pro, where are these run?
I think we still need to run on VMC at this moment until we make it very general. Maybe, I don't know, can be running on. I think we have to run under VMC right now.
I think we always have to run on VMC, right? We need vSphere infrastructure, right? So
yes.
So this container above the container running on Pro cluster, that's running on Google, and
this container running on Google, yes.
So and it's going to create this bootstrap cluster on VMC.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, just please let me know if this doesn't make sense to you. I want to get
so that point that I just made, can you add that to the diagram that this is running on this cluster and this is running on VMware's infrastructure?
Okay, I will
That'll just make it a little bit more clear. How about timeline, Hui? Do you have an idea, or can you give a guesstimate of even a date that you hope you get this done by?
Yeah, I hope I can make the all the necessary change from my side by the end of next week.
Okay, cool.
And with all the, mostly is to the stuff wrap around the secrets. So for now, we are not using secrets at all, but we need to put everything in secret and how to transfer to. So we have 2 containers.
Okay.
Basically,
Okay.
then I'll immediately talk to the Pro engineer to how to get it configured in Pro.
Okay. So the last question I have about this is, and I think we talked about it earlier. What about moving the CI code into the main repo?
Yeah. I don't see a problem of doing that, but maybe that's not a highest priority. I think a little bit. I think make it work with Pro probably has a highest priority.
Oh yeah,
and
for sure.
Actually, Pro don't need to know where this code located, and then we can. They only need to know where the container, the CI containers. Then we can independently update our CI code, move that to the Cluster API vSphere main repo after that.
Okay.
But I want to confirm the second one. The second one is, so we have a Bootstrap cluster, and then we run a CI job. This CI job is basically called cluster CTL to create the target cluster and make sure the target cluster is created and healthy. That's we call an end-to-end test. So actually, all information that's required for the CI job basically is a few secrets and some configuration info.
Okay. So I do want to mention the reason why I want to move some of that code to the main repo, and is the main thing I want to move to the main repo is the end-to-end test, because right now, if we modify the end-to-end test, that's in your repo. And let's say I want to add some end-to-end tests, then I can't. And if it was in the main repo, I could add end-to-end tests and without touching the containers. Yeah, that way it allows multiple people to add more end-to-end tests. Because right now, the end-to-end test right now it just calls cluster CTL, and it assumes that everything is fine when it's done. But I can tell you from doing a lot of debugging that that's not always the case. You really have to verify with the objects in the cluster whether everything was created properly.
Yeah. You're definitely right. The reason we are not adding many verification yet is due to we want to get it running first, and we know we need to add more verification there. Okay. And that's not a problem. And also, yeah, we have to move to the main repo so that everyone can contribute.
So is it okay if I start adding some end-to-end test scripts in the main repo, and then at some point, you figure out how to execute them?
Yeah. So from if you can see, we have the target cluster created, and I think we have the target cluster kube config file, then if your verification is based on that assumption, then we can easily call those verification scripts or some binary, whatever.
Okay.
Basically, from this line, we don't have further verification right now, but we can plug that. Plug
Okay.
more.
So I'll go ahead and start writing some, and I'll add it to the main repo, and then you can figure out how to call them in your container before your container code gets migrated to the main repo.
Okay, I think it will work.
Okay, I think that's all we have for CI. Next is updates on the OVA. Mr. Fabio.
Yep. So OVA is, had a little bit of a stop last week given the KubeCon China, but I have an OVA dash work branch in my fork. So freposoli / cluster API provider vSphere. There's a branch called OVA work where I'm basically building the whole process of building off an OVA and then bootstrapping a cluster to have an initial what we call the bootstrap cluster to then run cluster API against and provision a target.
I've been calling it the management cluster, but
management cluster, yeah, I like it better, yeah.
Yeah.
So far, good progress, and we're basically building off a previous VMware open source project called VIC. The main reason why is that this gives us a whole lot of reusable piece of code that we can reuse, not just the build process of the OVA. The build process itself is actually pretty interesting because at the time we work on a build process that did not require to use an hypervisor to build a VM. So we're building the entire OVA, which is a VM image. We can even build that inside a container, so it's very CI friendly. So building off of that, we're building a Photon VM based on Photon OS, and the plan is to reuse some of the work that Andrew Cutts has been using for bootstrapping the end-to-end and the end-to-end and conformance tests for Kubernetes and in-tree and out-of-tree cloud provider for vSphere. So we're basically using a lot of the work that has already been done for various other open source projects that we worked on in the past. Right now, the status for the OVA work is that the OVA builds, and I'm now troubleshooting a kind of a interesting problem where the initial boot is basically not displaying any outputs until the VM is actually booted up and ready to run. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on with that, but it's in pretty good shape. I'm planning to continue working on the initial bootstrap of the Kubernetes cluster. So we're going to have a single master Kubernetes cluster running inside the OVA once it's deployed. And given that I know this is a Thanksgiving week for most of the US, given I'm not based in the US, I'm going to continue working the entire week on this. So I expect to have good progress, possibly having the entire end-to-end workflow working by the end of next week.
Wow,
I haven't
awesome.
been working on this feature as a branch inside the main repo, just because there's a lot of churn, there's a lot of new files, and also there's a lot of leftovers that I'm trying to clean up before actually sending out a PR. So expect to see something, probably maybe a work in progress PR coming in maybe early next week, and potentially finalizing that by the end of next week.
So the thing that you're debugging, just for public record, since most of us already know, this is around admin.conf not showing up sometimes, right? So this is around kubeadm. There seems to be.
Oh no, this is a different problem. The problem with the admin config is a provisioning on ESX and actually provisioning on vCenter. There's a problem that I'm facing in general with Cluster API with some of the templates I'm trying out. Sometimes the provisioning process doesn't end well for some reason that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Basically, the entire process works from a provisioning perspective, so the drivers seem to be fine. There's a moment where the Cluster API expects to fetch the config file from the VM, from a master VM through an SSH, through SCP, and SCP tries to connects correctly to the VM, so it has all the the setup is done correctly, so it has the SSH key and everything, but it cannot fetch the file because the file is simply not there, and this stalls the entire process of provisioning, and it makes the entire process failing.
So does it never get there, or does it just takes a long time?
No, it never gets there. It just fails after an X amount of time.
Okay. And what was the other thing that you said that you were debugging?
Oh, this is the one that I'm debugging. Is just from the OVA perspective. We're building the OVA, and once we're starting up the OVA so once you provision the OVA artifact into a running vSphere environment, once you boot it up, there's no output showing up in the console, which is I'm actually expecting to see output coming out of the VM, and I'm not seeing the initial. There's a dialog that should show up in Virtual Terminal 2 saying you booted up this VM, blah blah blah. This is the IP address. This is the network status is green, etc., etc. Just something like that. We already have in there, and nothing is showing up. So there's no. It seems like there's no video output for some reason. So, and this might have something to do with the EFI boot process that PhotonOS 2.0 is using instead of the old BIOS. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on with that, and potentially even revert back to the BIOS boot.
Okay, Fabio, can you modify the file with that last describing that last thing that you just said?
Yeah, I can
just modify the just add it to the meeting notes.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay.
So just for my knowledge, so with the OVA deployed, what we can expect from that? We are getting the Bootstrap cluster, and also we deploy the CRE to it.
Yeah.
So basically
everything except for the VM template. So the user is going to have to deploy a VM template separately.
Okay. Okay, good. So we are not. So a question for Fabio is, so we will print the VM IP on the screen, and how about the kube config?
So the plan is that this service that I was telling about that shows the IP address of the VM and so on also has a HTTP endpoint that is going to be our API endpoint for the management cluster. Right now, the only thing that we'll do, it will serve you the kube config from the Bootstrap cluster. So that's the only reason to be right now. Potentially, it will become something, I don't know, potentially more more useful in the future. Right now, it's only we're only going to use it to serve back the kube config that we're going to use to then provision the target cluster.
Okay, yeah, great. Another question is, how can we use this OVA in the CI, in the E2E CI, if it's ready soon? Then.
So I think right now, we can definitely add the build process of the OVA. Because the build process is very easy to set up and just requires basically a Docker endpoint to run. To test the resulting OVA, I will wait a little bit to see, once we have at least a stable a stable OVA that can boot up and perform some function at the end. And then we can definitely do some automation around deploying that to a vSphere install, like a VMC, and then testing that the kubeconfig can can be fetched from the deployed OVA, and we can connect through kubectl and get nodes or inspect their new running cluster.
Okay, yeah, I think we need to, because it's end-to-end, so we have to test OVA as well, since it's a critical part. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we can just wait a little bit and.
Okay. So let's move on to the update on the ESX provisioning.
Sorry, just to finish up on this, just for consider this a black box testing, where you basically have three commands. One is through govc or through OVF tool, you deploy the OVA, then you fetch the kubeconfig with a curl command, and then you run kubectl get nodes. So it's basically, consider that as a black box testing. So you don't want to test the inside of the OVA. You just want to build it and test it as a black box.
Yeah, we want to use it as a black box. It's like a how the user use this OVA.
Yes, exactly.
Right, thanks.
Okay, cool, guys. So let's move on to the next one, the ESX provisioning. I think we already discussed this morning, but Fabio, would you just talk about that for the public record?
Sure, absolutely. ESX provisioning is basically done, meaning that there's a PR, there's a work in progress PR out there in the repo. You can check out the PR and build it and test it. It will work against a single standalone ESX host. The only reason why I haven't actually merged the PR or continued, rebasing that to master, is that there's this, weird problem that I was talking about before, where sometimes even with the same set of YAML files, with the same template, it will just fail in deploying. And failing in deploying, not because of the provisioning part, because the provisioning part works correctly. So it deploys it uses a template, deploys a new VM based on that template, configures everything, runs kubeadm, and then once it's time to fetch the admin.config file through SSH, it will fail. So I'm not 100% confident of the entire flow.
Okay.
So
the admin conf is actually a bug with the ESX provisioning and not an issue around the OVA.
No, this was more something that I encountered both with ESX and VC. Okay. So it must be something in the environment. So I'm testing against two specific environments. One being just a plain ESX host that I'm standing up on my own machine as a VM. So it's a nested ESX. And the other one is my home lab, which is a small vSphere cluster with vCenter and everything. And they're both running 6.7. So I'm wondering if it has something to do with 6.7. I haven't actually tested on 6.5, so I might try to do that later today, because I can do that. At least I can rev differently the standalone ESX on my machine, but I cannot rev back my home lab, at least not easily. So I'll test it and see if the problem goes away. I'm not confident that it will go away, because it's kind of interesting due to the fact that it's something that has to do with the configuration that happens inside the VM once it's running. It's not something that is done, at the vSphere layer. It's not done through the API calls of vSphere, which is why I'm wondering if the vSphere version has anything to do with it. But again, I haven't pinpointed that problem. I haven't, root caused it, and I mostly stopped focusing on provisioning on ESX because I wanted to get the OVA done. So if there's somebody who wants to test it for me and see if with their environment works, I will be very happy to get the feedback.
So Fabio, we also talked offline about that this the ESX moving the ESX PR from WIP to non-WIP is going to be opportunistic between now and KubeCon, where the OVA is priority, right? Basically,
Yeah,
OVA work first, and then if
yeah,
we have time, the ESX
yeah,
provision. Yeah.
absolutely. I want to have the OVA done for KubeCon because it's going to be an interesting thing. Well, first of all, it's going to be an interesting thing to show, and second, it will be an interesting topic to talk about with other cluster API folks around using the management cluster pattern instead of
Yeah.
the self-serving one, as you were mentioning before. So I think it's more important for us to finish that first and move on to the ESX provision second, and hopefully have both done. But again, it's going to be opportunistic for the short time frame.
Okay, great. So let's moving on. Update on vSphere and testing. Doug, do you want to jump in? Oh, well, I mean, yeah, Doug, if you want to jump in and talk about this.
Yeah, I don't have any updates other than I'm about to get started on that work. I haven't done anything other than I went through the quick start over the weekend because I hadn't actually built the source yet, but opened a PR for that. So I'm hoping to start making some progress on that this week.
Okay. And do you want to talk about some of the challenges that we're going to be facing with simulating something like cluster API on vSphere?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how far we end up taking it, but I think obviously one of the big challenges is actually being able to stand up services and being able to talk to some of the API endpoints, and I guess there's some SSH involved at some point. But I think we took things pretty far with the recent work that Andrew did with Yakety. So he's actually, with Yakety, able to stand up a multi-master cluster against vSphere.
Nice.
So it's promising, but I expect that we'll definitely have some challenges, and it might actually involve adding support to have a VM power on to actually start a container, and then populate the virtual machine guest info with networking information like IP address and that kind of stuff. And then likewise, the power off, stopping the container, destroy, deleting it. So that's kind of what I have in mind right now, but I don't really know how feasible that is until I start digging in. So should have an update on that next time.
So we talked earlier that this work with the vSphere is going to be quite large, and it might span 2 quarters, because some of the things that we face, challenges that we face trying to deploy this cluster on a fake VC is quite interesting and quite large, right?
Yep.
Okay. So the other part of this update is that we are going to try to add more testing. This both involves unit tests and some beefing up the end-to-end tests. Unfortunately, this is a holiday week, so that work, we'll try to do some of that, but at the same time, I'm also trying to prepare for KubeCon and trying to update documentation. I am working on a Git book document for the vSphere provider repo. And I'm hoping that I can have something that I can share with all of you guys starting tomorrow. So I'm working on that. So next week I'll get to adding more unit testing and end-to-end tests.
Hey, look, we can sync offline on the Git book.
Okay.
I've done that before. It's basically just there's nothing special to be done. There's just a different branch that we have to publish on the main repo called GH pages. And once we have that branch going, it's going to be an orphan branch where we basically have a different history compared to the rest of the repo. And you're going to have just HTML files that are the output of Gitbook, basically.
So I don't know how the VCP and Vic did the Gitbook before. But Gitbook also has a hosting service, and you can actually create the documentation in their on their service. I assume when you were talking about different branch, I assume that you're using some kind of command line tool to create this. And
so what you saw on the Gitbook site is basically just what you see is what you get editor.
Mm-hmm.
Gitbook is really based on Markdown files, and there's a post processor that basically turning those Markdown files into HTML files with a specific layout. And the Gitbook editor that you saw is basically just doing that under covers and showing you a nice nice web editor UI. The thing is that once you have the output from that, even if you use that service and you point that service to a Git repo, which is usually what it does. I'm not sure if there are any other outputs, but basically what you do is you use the editor on the website, you point that website to a Git repo where you have permission to push content, and it will basically just push those HTML files, the resulting HTML files into the repo. And GitHub is, through that branch that I was talking about, is basically publishing that specific branch to a website. And this is how most of the website you see hosted on GitHub are actually published. Gitbook is basically just turning that into more effective way of writing documentation, because it gives you the basically the layout. That's it.
Okay. Okay. Great. We'll talk offline about how to do that when maybe sometime tomorrow when I'm ready to show more. At least shared with the internal people so that you guys can review it. And yeah. So
sure.
Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is this idea. So we signed up for a task about 2 months ago around pluggable status. It's basically this. The idea was that every provider may have specific requirements during the steps that is performed by cluster CTO. And the biggest back then it was about, well, how do you determine that a machine is up and running? And back then we were talking about well, every infrastructure may have different ways to say that a machine is finished and a cluster is finished. So when I was looking at cluster delete this last week, and this also applies to cluster create, the workflow for these are baked into cluster CTL. And unfortunately, those workflow don't work for us, especially cluster delete. The current cluster delete workflow will just hang because it's doing two operations that are unnecessary for us. And I'm not sure if it's really necessary for any provider, but it's there. So either nobody has tried cluster delete and it was just there as legacy, or it just doesn't work for us. The other workflow, the cluster create, also has a problem. The cluster create workflow assumes a self-service model. So the self-service model is it creates a bootstrap cluster, uses the bootstrap cluster to applies the cluster API to the bootstrap cluster, and then after that, it uses the bootstrap cluster to create the target cluster, and then it copies the status over to the objects to the target cluster and delete the bootstrap cluster. It does that so that at least the objects for the that represents the target cluster is somewhere. It's now on the target cluster. When you have a management model, a management cluster model, you don't need to copy the cluster API onto the target cluster, right? Because all of that information is in the management cluster. So that step of copying cluster API onto the target cluster is not necessary for the vSphere provider. So what does this mean? This means that the workflow for create and delete doesn't actually work well for the vSphere provider, and but it might work well for other providers. So I have this idea that it should be the provider should define the necessary workflow for each of these operations. And then the cluster CTL should be able to take that workflow definition. So you might have a workflow definition for self-service, workflow for a management style, or a workflow that's dependent on the provider. And then cluster CTL should execute the operations based on that workflow. So I am working on a proposal that I'm going to present next week to the cluster API on a way that I think that we can do this. The goal is that the workflow the user shouldn't have to do anything with the workflow, and it should be completely within cluster CTL to do. So I'm not exactly yet sure whether the provider container should provide the workflow definitions, or maybe we just build it into some like Go template and define the workflows there. Somehow it needs to get into cluster CTL without the user interaction. And I'm still thinking through that, and I'm working on the proposal right now. So if anybody wants to participate, please join and get your name on a proposal that we will present next week. Okay, that's all I have on that topic.
Do you have a separate meeting, saying?
I don't have a separate meeting. I am just working on the document, and then I'll just send it out to over email or over Slack, and we can all talk about it on Slack.
Okay, I'll join the discussion there. I have a particular question regarding the deletes. Do we support like delete a particular machine, or we basically delete the whole cluster?
Right now, you delete the whole cluster. There is no way to delete a specific. There is no way that I know of to delete a particular cluster. I mean, all a particular machine. All the machines are supposed to be uniform. What you can do, and this is something we haven't tested with the vSphere provider, is that because they're objects in Kubernetes, you can actually live edit the object, right? You can when you deploy machines at YAML, you can actually use kubectl to live edit that object, and Cluster API is supposed to react to it and make the changes.
That's basically what I mean. We should be able to like apply updates on the YAML file, and basically let's controller to calculate the delta and react.
Yeah, that is as meant to be the goal of Cluster API.
I guess so. Actually, I think probably already discussed, because this is actually a request from autoscaler because they want to scale down.
Yeah. And but Cluster autoscaler has other requirements. There's been a lot of discussion in the Cluster API working group about this. I haven't looked at cluster autoscaler for a couple months, so I know about it. I know how it works, but I don't know all the details that we need to update to cluster API in order to integrate with cluster autoscaler. Okay. So we're completely out of time. We only have 2 minutes left. I think we had a good discussion today with the updates. If there's no other topics, I think we can call it a day. And
Hey, look, just one thing. When you have the proposal ready for review,
yeah,
for the discussion, maybe send it to the SIG VMware mailing list so you get a wider audience.
okay, yeah. SIG VMware mailing list, you said?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah. If there's nothing else, then I wish everybody a happy day. And if I don't talk to anybody else this week, well, I'm sure I will. Happy Thanksgiving for those of us in America.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving to you too.
Hey, bye, guys.
Bye, folks. Bye-bye.
Happy Thanksgiving, guys.